Hi, my name's AuBry Erickson, and for my sociology final, I chose the book Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City by Matthew Desmond. This book focuses on housing and poverty, and it looks at what eviction what looks like in real life for people who are struggling financially. It asks some questions. How does eviction contribute to and stem from the cycle of poverty? Does the experience of eviction primarily lead individuals into poverty, or is it most often a consequence of already being in poverty? Also, in what ways do eviction and poverty reinforce each other in a cyclical pattern? Which direction does the relationship between eviction and poverty flow most strongly? Eviction as a precipitating factor of poverty, or poverty as a precursor to eviction? The book focuses on housing instability as a major social problem. What that means is that people who are already struggling financially are more likely to lose their housing, and once they do, it becomes really hard to recover and find stability again. The research questions the book focuses on are why eviction is so common and also how it affects people's lives. One example from the book is a woman named Arlene, who is a single mother of young children living in Milwaukee. She falls behind on the rent and ends up getting evicted. After that, she struggles to find another place to live. Because of her record of eviction, she ends up moving from place to place. This shows how eviction doesn't just happen once, it creates ongoing instability. The author of this book, Matthew Desmond, is a professor of sociology. He studies poverty, he lived in the communities themselves, and he's the founder and principal investigator of the Eviction Lab at Princeton University. He also got the MacArthur Genius Grant Award in 2015. This book uses conflict theory, which focuses on an inequality of power and power differences between groups. In this group, the power differences are between the landlords and the tenants. The landlords often can keep the tenants kind of in poverty by continuing to evict them from different rentals. And because they have more money to go to court and fight through judges and the legal process than the tenants have, they're able to do so and quickly reestablish new tenants in their houses because there's always more tenants in poverty and they can actually make more money off the tenants who are in poverty than they can among tenants that make more money. They also can rent out properties that are not as good and not as highly maintained. So this connects to conflict theory because it shows the power difference between landlords and tenants and shows how the tenants so often aren't able to recover, and especially if they're already struggling financially. So even if someone's trying hard, they can still lose their housing. The method that this sociologist researcher Desmond used was anthology. That's because he followed real people over time and lived in the communities where they were living. He also was able to study the landlords as well. Because he followed real people, he was able to show us examples of different people and their circumstances, and he saw things that you would normally not always see if you were using a different approach or a different method of study. So he was able to see how this eviction process stressed people out and affected them firsthand emotionally and psychologically. He was also conducted interviews to understand their experiences and what they were going through. And so because of that method, there are many detailed stories in the book about different people who have been evicted and their landlords and what their life circumstances look like and their relationships between their neighbors, themselves, and their landlords to tenant relationships. Findings. One of the main findings is that eviction is very common among people living in poverty. What that means is that people don't just get evicted once, it can happen repeatedly, and it makes it harder each time to recover. Just like a criminal record, it goes on your long-term record so that you continue to have a harder and more difficult time each application applying for housing and getting new housing every time you've been evicted. It just shows a shows up negatively on your track record. So landlords will often not rent, or it'll become harder and harder and more difficult to rent. So with the mother in the book, she kept getting stuck in unstable housing situations and unstable situations with her neighbors. And so the book shows how, especially a lot of women get stuck in poverty. So as the men in this book were being locked up in jail and things like that, the women were being locked out of their homes and losing their stability. So another example of, other than the single mom, was also a man named Lamar, who was disabled because of his leg, living on disability. He wasn't able to, he was on a fixed income and wasn't able to catch up on his rent. And even though he was trying and struggling to keep up, it still led him to being evicted. Not because he wasn't trying, but because of situations and circumstances that are extremely out of their control and unable um, to foresee. They end up with these situations where they're behind on their rent for medical bills or, different reasons. And so that shows how eviction isn't always about people making bad choices. Sometimes it's about their unforeseen circumstances that come up. And on the other side, the landlords are still making money from the low income tenants because they still can collect the rent even when, their bills that come up that are larger than what they foresaw. So housing costs versus income. So a lot of times going into that, they're also on a, fixed income or just a minimal income. So a lot of times people in poverty, most people are making 50%, of their income they pay to rent. But in the case of people in poverty, a lot of times some of them are paying up to 70 or 80% of their income. So that leaves them with so little extra, and they end up falling behind on their rent because of that. So after paying rent, there's just not enough money to make, you know, to take care of their basic needs. And so even a small setback, like just losing hours of work, can have a substantial impact on them and on their ability to pay rent. So that explains why eviction happens so often. This work is so important because it changes how people think about poverty. So having Desmond live in those situations and studying each of these circumstances of the people, we're able to see into their lives and understand more closely the struggle that they go through to try and make ends meet. How eviction, how getting kicked out of your home causes you so much instability. So a lot of these people's personal belongings and everything were thrown out on the street. They had lost their memories and their lives, and sometimes their artifacts, like their, treasures that had been passed down through their families, because they had nowhere to put them. They were homeless, and then they were still struggling and having to continue working and stay on their feet to try to get into the next available housing. And so stories like, Lamar's and Arlene's, the single mom, have a real, it shows how eviction has a real impact on families. It also helps us raise awareness so that we can maybe understand better how to change the policies surrounding rentals and the larger systems in place that make it difficult for people to stay stable even when they're trying. So causing and affecting change in that way. It also helps people understand that housing isn't just about having a place to live. It's about having stability in your life and understanding not having to live in constant anxiety and fear of being on the streets or not being able to eat. So just being able to have your basic needs met, like food and shelter. Shelter is a big one in order to obtain the other needs that you have. So what stood out to me most is how quickly things can change and how people can go from having a place to live and being completely stable to being completely unstable, and the little children, how their lives are affected, their school is affected, their relationships are affected, and just how quickly that can cause such fragile instability amongst these families. Personal reflection. I am a mother of 8 children who got divorced from a very high conflict situation. I ended up without housing as a judge stamped an order giving my housing to my former husband, and I was forced to try to find housing as quickly as possible for myself and my 8 children, and in the process ended up only being able to find housing for 4 of my children. So it had a big emotional effect on my family personally to be left with unstable housing and in transition. I'd also tried to leave several times before this with my children, going to women's shelters and trying to get housing without being able to show a regular stable income is impossible. So I'd end up back with their father. And then once I was finally divorced and had a decree showing child support, I was able to show stable housing, although he did take me back to court and withdrew the child support. So then again, I was left destabilized again with my housing. So I have had firsthand experience with this, and I can say that Desmond in this book does a great job of showing the impact of an instability and emotional impact and physical impact that losing housing has on families in our society. So I felt a very real connection, and I feel that he did a good job of explaining this in this book, and that it really did solve a good problem. And in conclusion, my final question is eviction a cause or a result of poverty? As we become more stable and have a stable place to live, we can then make more money, and it propels us forward. If we're unable to have basic needs like housing, it can circle us down into more and more poverty. So that is the conclusion of my presentation. Thank you.